Hi, everybody. I'm Scott, and thanks for joining me again today for another edition of the podcast in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier. Today, we're going to talk about my favorite part of the film. We're getting deep in our own heads, friends. And what we're going to talk about are some parts of the film that show up in every segment of the film, and that's the analysis, the psychological analysis by two professionals who we brought on to take a look at everything that was going on with my family and how it all might have stemmed and flowed, beginning with my great-grandparents on my mother's side, Rose Wolkoff, and her to-be husband, Julius Meltzer. But before we dig into all of that, why don't we take a look at the trailer for the film, Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier.
Who doesn't love a rags to riches story? But a rags to riches to collapse story?
There were two Evans furs. The one that climbed to the top of the highest peak, amazing story, and the one that tumbled from that peak decades later. But that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is what happened in between.
They lived the American dream, and they let a lot of people come in and live it with them. And it was a wonderful story until it wasn't.
Coming from a generation that was so driven and willing to work 18 hours a day to be successful, there aren't that many people like that anymore.
They created something out of whole cloth, and he helped kings and queens around the world with their fur coats.
That was the era, I would say, the golden era of department stores and specialty stores.
Genetics loads the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger.
Non-existent parenting, and so they didn't learn how to cope with stresses.
And I just look at the damage that my father created and the things that he has said.
But it certainly caused a significant rift in the family and families, and a number of us didn't communicate with each other for a long time.
You marry into the family, you marry into the business, because that is your life.
Clearly, there were problems.
So, as my cousin Marnie Miller will describe to you in a minute from the film, my great-grandparents came to this country in 1912. My great-grandmother Rose was still a spinster at the age of 29, and her three brothers, who had some money and some intelligence, they were engineers on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They essentially sold her to my great-grandfather Julius. Now, I chuckle, but it was commonplace at the time. It's commonplace today in many parts of the world. But here, I'll let Marnie explain.
Julius was a rabbi, and Rose was a spinster. She was 29 years old when she got married. Her brothers bought her a husband, and she had 3 kids, and I don't know which one of them or both of them decided they wanted to come to America. But Rose would only come first class. She had several wealthy brothers who were part of the engineering crew for the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and they wanted to get rid of her. And they bought her, her husband, and the 3 kids first-class tickets on a steamship.
So Janet Graham, who is a marriage and marriage family therapist in Malibu, California, was so gracious to be a part of this film and to lend her professional analysis to all the various sections of things. And here's what she has to say about Rose and her three Trans-Siberian engineering brothers whose names I don't know. So that's just how I refer to them.
Starting with Rose, I was wondering what her parents were like. You can keep going back
Right.
the way, but we start with Rose and Julius and the brother. Then you say, well, the brothers were very successful. Now, I don't know how happy they were. I don't know what their life was like, but she, then you get into genetics in a way, that certain people are born with a predisposition, towards optimism and resilience. And it's a genetic thing, and others are more sensitive and more anxious, and they need to be doing something else, and they need to find their own path. But she wasn't allowed to do that.
So as you find out in the film, once they come to America, my great-grandmother, Rose, she goes to bed to stay. My great-grandfather, Julius, he can't find a way to make enough money and to find a lane for himself to have a career and take care of the family. So the breakdown starts to happen there. My great-grandmother, Rose, gets depressed, and eventually, even though they have 3 more kids, she goes to bed to stay, pretty much abandoning and abdicating her responsibilities as the matron of this brood of 6 children and her husband. A.L. and Herman go to work, and what comes out of that is Evans Furs, which is part of the main topic of this series of films. Younger brothers Jack and Bernie get to pursue law degrees, which was their dream. My grandmother, Thelma, the oldest daughter, is sent to finishing school so that she can learn to care for them all. And youngest sister, Edith, she's just kind of left out there in the cold because women weren't allowed to go to college and pursue their dreams in those days. And Jack and Bernie were allowed to do so on the backs of the early success of Evans.
My grandfather, Julius, became a peddler. There were too many rabbis, I guess, in South Philadelphia. My grandmother did nothing. She sat on her backside and bossed everybody around, particularly her oldest daughter, Thelma, who really became the mother of the children that were to follow.
Once they came here, there wasn't much money. It was very difficult for my grandmother. She didn't learn the language very well, and she kind of went to bed and stayed there and let Aunt Thelma take over running the house. And Uncle Mal and Uncle Herman left school and went to work.
Part of what we leave out of that is the interior life. We can see what they do. We can see them making bed, cooking dinner, taking care of kids. But we don't know what they're thinking and what their experience is and where their pleasures and frustrations are. And they have to live with those. And if you're entrapped, you can't escape them. You're locked in there. This is the life you're going to have. But that thing of being denied the opportunity to be who we are is fundamental. One of the questions everybody's asking, but they don't know they're asking it, is what's the meaning of my life for me? Am I living a life that's meaningful for me? Is it satisfying my needs, my inclinations, my temperaments, my interests as they change over time? But if we're allowed to make changes over time, there's a vitality that comes with that.
So as I said, the kids are starting to find their own lane. They're being forced to figure things out at extremely early ages. And they're all responding to this depression that's being handed down to them in different ways. By manically working, by manically studying, by manically cooking and cleaning, or by manically being depressed.
My mother was a model at a store downtown Philadelphia, and my father went to work at that store. Somehow, I don't know how, ended up in the fur department. With his knowledge of furs, he became well known in the business. And somebody from Chicago offered him a better job, more money, and a managerial job. My father and mother picked up and moved to Chicago, not knowing a soul. And my father went to work for this man for several months and found out he was a goner and couldn't work for him anymore. So he quit, and he said to my mother, I'm going to open up my own store. They put an ad in the Tribune, in the Sunday Tribune, for squirrel scarves, which were very popular in the early 30s. And somehow he came up with the name Evans, and he rented a storefront in the State and Lake building. And Monday morning, my mother and father walked up the, how many flights it was, and women were lined up 4 flights down by the squirrel scarves. This is in the midst of the Depression, and that's how the business got started. They sold out in an hour.
But he had integrity. He couldn't work for a shyster. And so he went out to start his own company. That says something about him, doesn't it? Or he could have stolen from the guy, or, there's a million things that could have happened. But so he had integrity. What I feel in my gut is somehow there was empathy for the father, that they felt sorry for him, maybe bad for him. And, they came to bat. Well, you can say, wow, look at what they accomplished. But were they happy? Well, also part of it was the times, the milieu of the times. It wasn't sort of, in vogue to go to a therapist, depending, especially if you're from Eastern Europe or England or something, so it wasn't it was accessible, but there was a stigma kind of about, going to therapy. That's admitting I have a problem, and then you bring shame upon the family. Well, the ultimate shame is your kid commits suicide.
What you'll start to see come out of this in the film, thus, is the survivor instinct.
He had a brother, Herman, who ran the New York office at the time. And I always got the impression that the reason he was in New York is because he was going to play second fiddle to my grandfather no matter what. And that way, number one, it had 2 of them separated so that they had their own fiefdoms. And number 2, there was always so much corruption in the fur industry that he wanted to have somebody who he trusted.
I adored Uncle Herman. He was wonderful to me. And he supported my father in the business. He always took second place. He never tried to usurp my dad, as far as I know.
What happens, however, is that oldest brother A.L. is in the lead, is in charge, has the purse strings, and everybody must follow along. Thus, Dr. Terry Whitman, who is a clinical psychologist in Washington State, explains to us what a difficult situation that is for anybody to be put into.
Parents that see this in their kids and don't decide for them what they need to be, but says, hey, let's try this. You want to play soccer? And the kid plays soccer and say, that's not for me. I don't like that. Well, okay, how about art? You want to take an art class? And they take that and they say, oh, that's better. I like that a little bit more. But by and large, most people don't get to do that enough. But it's the antidote to depression, to anxiety disorders, and that's finding out what's inside me, what gives me meaning, what gives me satisfaction. Not what pleases other people, but what meets my needs.
So as far as the business goes, there's this proven way of doing things from A.L., from Herman, from Minerva, from Harold Sussman, and it worked. And the business kept growing and growing and growing. However, when the next generation came along and took over, beginning with A.L.'s son, David Meltzer, there was a clash of cultures between the old and the new. I guess, kind of unavoidable. Again, another theme you'll constantly see throughout the film as part of the struggle that everybody in my family, to this day in some cases, was going through.
After a while, he went into a very bad cycle of depression. They gave him electric shocks, which furthered his depression. He never was the same after he had the electrical shock.
Who knows what motivated them? But, like I say, some kids are born with a predisposition. When all that pressure's placed on them, it motivates them. Other kids feel inadequate. Maybe they have the chops for something else. Maybe they're artists and they could be successful in another area, but when you're not allowed to do that, what are your options? There's something about being needed. Herman and Eyal, they were needed in that family. And they did what was needed of them, and same with Thelma. And so then Jack had the luxury of going to Jack and what was the other one?
Bernie.
They both had the luxury of, going to law school and doing that because of the way the road was paved for them. But Jack wasn't happy. He achieved all of this and he was miserable.
Another example in the generational change was in the way that David Meltzer chose to live his life compared to his father. Frugal kind of went out the window, as I'll let his sister Marnie explain.
David was using it for his own self-aggrandizement. That's a good word. That really says it all. He had all these toys, and he lived the grand life, which is what he wanted.
What people don't realize, I mean, if you've been a psychologist long enough and you talk to thousands of people and you get to meet them and you get to hear their stories, is what you find is there are some blind alleys in life. One of those is the pursuit of money. That if I get enough money, then I can be happy. So we pursue money and we find out it really doesn't make us happy. Pursuing an audience. I want people to notice me. I want popularity. I want recognition. That's another blind alley common in our culture. Looks for women can be also another blind alley. Well, if I wear the right clothes, if I have the right hair, the right style, then I'll be happy. Nope, it's got to be deeper than that. It has to be that essence, that's something inside us that's pressing for expression. And if we get to express it, we're happy. If it's blocked, if it's cut off, there's this sense of failure, there's anxiety, there's resentment, there's just all this stuff that goes on.
Now, I'm going to share something with you. You all know, we all know, this isn't going to be too enlightening to anybody, but money does not make you happy. And there's another favorite saying we have in the film: money doesn't care who has it. When it comes to having tragedy foisted upon you, your wealth doesn't really get in the way of affecting you beneficially in that regard.
Money doesn't bring happiness. People think, it's so interesting to watch people in their 20s inching up to 30, like, where are you going? Where are you going so fast? And once you get there, it's like what we call the hedonic treadmill. It's just, no matter, you get this goal, you get that goal, you keep running. When do you relax and enjoy and appreciate what you've created?
Being born into wealth has a lot of advantages. There's no question about that. But it may not foster at all the happiness, the well-being of the kids, the cousins, those that are tied into it. To me, again, that's another example of that blind alley. It looks so attractive from the outside, like, oh, if we're the Kennedys or if we're the Rockefellers, if we're the Vanderbilts, we're going to be really, really happy. But when you look into those families, That's not what you see. So it doesn't surprise me, as you describe your family, that what I keep hearing again is big shots, tyrannical, people that are afraid of them, that type of thing.
And by the time it got to my generation, where there were many of us from the family working in the business, there was this unhealthy competition that was encouraged. Everything that initial generation lived by, that one for all and all for one kind of way of doing things, seemed to be gone and by the wayside by the time the mid-70s came around and a lot of us came into the business. And, a lot of us were pitted against each other. And it was not a good thing.
Look at the position he was in. Look at who he is as opposed to who you are. And don't let it affect your own self-esteem. It was a very authoritarian approach to child rearing, okay? And that's what they knew. They didn't know any better. Like, if they lived in this day and age, there are a lot of, people talking about different ways of raising kids. Now, we've all, gone backwards the other way of gentle parenting, which doesn't necessarily work either. So there's some place in the middle. Kids need some bit of authoritative direction, but not authoritarian. There's a difference. Kids need boundaries. Okay. So if David had called you aside and said, hey, man, I hate to do this. I know you have your own style going and stuff, but for the company image, it kind of doesn't work. And I don't know, I don't mean to insult you.
One of the most important things we can do as a parent, or if we're in a relationship with the grandkids or neighbor kids, I think it's one of our roles as adults, if we've lived a while, is to become good mirrors. Like if you look at a mirror, you can see yourself. You see yourself reflected back. Often when we're growing up, we have only a fuzzy sense of who we are and what we can become. And people that are good mirrors, people that are good mentors, see some of the characteristics that are inherent in that child, something to do with their temperament and their talents. And we point that out to them. We catch them in that and we say, wow, Scott, you have got some poetic skills. You can really write. Have you thought about doing some writing? So it's that type of encouragement, recognition of seeing somebody for who they really are and encouraging the expression of that. And I'm not hearing that took place in your family over these generations. It was just the opposite of that.
Let's remember that at the end of the day, this all traces back somewhere, right? And I think in this case, to my great-grandparents, Rose and Julius Meltzer on my mother's side. Although most professionals will tell you it probably goes back well before them. Now, this goes back generations or maybe dozens of generations, this recurring problem and this inherent depression in the family.
But look at what she created.
Right.
Maybe there was something in her, that knew something.
For kids trophies?
Well, I mean, I don't think she was, maybe. I mean, isn't that kind of the way the family rolls? I think if you can have empathy and understanding for these ancestors, I think that frees you. And if you can do it in life while it's happening, it's really freeing. If you can separate enough and know who you are from however you're treated, that's half the battle of being an individual and knowing who you are.
One of the most painful emotions we can experience is anxiety. And when you talk about feeling terrified, that's deep, deep anxiety. And anything that'll reduce anxiety brings pleasure. But one of the most painful experiences we can have is to live with that type of an anxiety, that fear. That's very, very different than growing up with a father who's warm, who's comforting, looks out to help you in any way he can, rather than being ready to shoot you down. Very, very, very different. And it's not healthy. You cannot live in constant anxiety. It's almost like living in a combat zone. If there's a threat there to the self, then that is always detrimental to growth and happiness.
Again, one of the things you'll see throughout the film is that each of the 6 children of Rose and Julius responded to that depression in different ways. And that's a recurring theme of the film as well.
They created a pattern that's been repeated. And as long as you repeat a pattern that causes casualties like it has, that leads to lives that are unfulfilling, where people don't get to choose their own destiny, there are going to be casualties. Do they make money along the way? Yeah, maybe a great deal of money. Maybe they lose the money. But the fundamental pattern that's the problem in terms of emotional well-being is this lack of acceptance of the self, the encouragement of choice, warmth, nurturing. Those are the missing elements that you've got to have.
Well, I hope that gives you a little more insight into the craziness of all this. Again, this is a story about family and a story about circumstances and a story about depression. Sure, it's disguised as a story about the rise and fall of this fur company empire, which it certainly was. But the layers of the onion are so many, and there's so much more to peel back to and from than just the story of this crazy business financial fur empire that began in 1929 and lasted until 1999 for 70 years. The story goes much deeper and much farther than that.
Julius and Rose Meltzer went forward with the belief that their son's death was an accident, and this setback rocked the family during a time when brother A.L. and Herman's Evans Furs was skyrocketing to the top of the industry.
Those Meltzer kids obviously weren't taught how to cope or how to parent or relationship skills were really lacking, and that got passed down.
All I know is that he had a photographic memory, he was brilliant, and the family loved him.
Yeah, I think she loved the way I looked, so she was always, like I was her little doll.
All of his grandchildren wrote reports on Nuremberg at some point in school. And someone would always have an assignment, interview some relative about something.
Nonchalantly would toss a question out, and the beads of sweat were pouring off as he's trying to answer Uncle Bernie's question.
A lot of people live in fear that, oh my God, is that going to happen to me?
In the end, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of customers got hurt. It was just a bad thing.
He's with this dinosaur, a toy dinosaur on the table, and he says, you know what happened to these dinosaurs?
It was a very unique era.
Jeff and I got some calls, and people were just sobbing.
Well, they shut the doors on people. That was pretty high profile.
A fish has got to swim and an eagle's got to soar. That's their natural temperament and how they want to live and how they want to play. And when that's blocked, people are really unhappy.
That's the trailer for part 2 of the film, and I'm so excited for you to be able to see it. I'm Scott, and I want to thank you for joining me today for this deep dive into their heads, the heads of my family, the ones involved in the film, Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier, and this is the podcast in support of that film. And I'm so glad you could join me for this today. Have a great day. I'll see you again next time.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier,
Ricky was in charge. And he was a prick. He was a prick.
There were just some very old thoughts in people's minds. And I'm not going to name the person, but he came into my office. And he said,
when we started, we opened up with 5 stores. And I remember Robinson's had 21 stores at the time, 21 facilities that they were selling furs at.
They did a lot of things better than anybody, and they did some things that weren't so good. And I learned a lot from the training program.
It was a very in thing to still show up in mink coats to everything in San Antonio. Not because they needed it, but because it was a fashion statement. Jeans and boots. And you'd see these women's with their torn up jeans and their faded jeans and their boots.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier,